Welcome to the Nourished Mumlife. This is episode 15, a conversation with David Gillespie. David Gillespie is a lawyer and the best-selling author of Sweet Poison, a book published in 2008 about how we are all poisoning ourselves with sugar. That book is generally credited with starting the current wave of sugar awareness in Australia. He followed Sweet Poison up with 4 more books about nutrition and diet. Then, having upset the dietetics industry by writing about stuff in which he has no qualifications, he turned his focus to something else he is unqualified to write about: education. In his 2014 work, Free Schools, David took a parent's eye view of the research and concluded that all the rolling green hockey fields and architect-designed amphitheatres won't make a jot of difference to the education your child is likely to receive if their school principal is no good at their job. But today we talked about David's current book, which has just been released, on the teen brain. This book is all about understanding what happens in your child's brain during the teenage period and why iPads and devices are designed to get them addicted, and how addictions translate then into high risk of anxiety and depression. So if you have a child of any age, I suggest you listen to this podcast and then buy David Gillespie's book. You're listening to the Nourished Mumlife podcast by Tracy McBeath. This podcast is all about empowering mums to live a nourished life right now. So grab a coffee, sit back and relax. Welcome, David Gillespie. Thank you so much for joining me. It's only my second male on the podcast, so thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, I feel like I've known you actually for a very long time because I have followed you since those Sweet Poison days about 10 years ago, and you've had such a profound impact on my family with all that you've done. So firstly, from a personal perspective, thank you so much for doing what you're doing and for sharing the information that you do share, because it does change lives and it's actually really changed our life. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
I guess there's probably a few people listening that may not actually heard of you, especially because I have people listening from overseas. So are you able to give everyone a little snapshot of who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. Okay. So I guess I started being an author. My first book, Sweet Poison, came out at the end of 2008, and it was about describing what happened to me when I quit sugar. Which was that I lost 40 kilos, and ever since then have stayed the same weight. Still no Adonis, but no longer going up in weight, which was what I'd been doing at every point in my life up till then. Now, the book was sort of a little bit about that, but mostly about why. What was the science, and what did it tell us about what sugar was, and in particular the fructose half of sugar was doing to us. It came up with a fairly simple prescription, which was don't eat sugar. But the interesting bit, and I think the bit people got interested in, was why. Everyone knew not to eat sugar. What they didn't know was why. And I guess that started me down a path. It became a pretty significant bestseller here in Australia. And with that, it may not make you a millionaire, but it certainly makes sure that publishers let you publish whatever you want to publish. So I just kept writing books about things that were interesting to me. I went on and wrote about seed oils in a book called Toxic Oil, which is vegetable oils and why they're, if anything, even worse for us than sugar. I wrote about the Australian education system in a book called Free Schools. I wrote about psychopaths in a book called Taming Toxic People. And in this current book, this is about teenagers, which I'm, I guess, practically qualified to speak about, having been one myself and having 6 of them as children. But once again, it comes up with a fairly simple set of things that we should do in dealing with the teenage years, but the why is something I've never read before. And that's, I guess, a theme with a lot of my books.
Absolutely. And, the fact that you are a dad of 6 is, fantastic. And I was just saying to my husband before he left for work today was that you, being a former lawyer, so people don't know that about you, that you were a lawyer. And
I still am a lawyer, actually.
Oh, you're still? Yeah. Right. Okay. I didn't realize that you were still involved in that. But just having that ability to read the science, if you like, which I think we all get very confused about, because there's a big disconnect often with the science and what we're told to do. Certainly in nutrition, there's a big gap. But being a dad of 6, you seem to have evolved along with your kids, and, you know, possibly as they've come up with things that have sparked your interest, you've allowed yourself to sort of go with that. And, you know, you say in the front of the book that it was your wife, Lizzie, that you talk about a little bit, and, you know, some of your friends who sort of said to you, look, maybe intuitively we don't think all this technology is good for our kids, but why isn't it? What's going on here, you know?
Do we have a real reason to be worried? Is I guess where they were coming from. As you say, they had an uneasy feeling, as did I, but I was a little less tough on it. You know, what can it really hurt? That kind of thing. Whereas Lizzie was significantly tougher and probably going on gut feeling, really. But both she and my publisher, Ingrid Olsen, who's been with me from the start since Sweet Poison, similar age, and had similar feelings about it. And they both really wanted me to look at, is there anything really to be concerned about with technology and its impact on teens, or is it just worry about nothing? Is it just a thing of, this is a modern thing and just ignore it? And so my initial response was I didn't think there was much I could add. There's lots of good parenting books out there that say keep kids away from devices. But they said, that's the easy thing to say, like don't eat sugar. But what we really want to understand is, if that's true, why is it true?
That's right. And there was one paragraph in the book that stood out to me straight away and, you know, stands out to a lot of mums I talk to. But it was saying the challenge of parents is to provide a safe environment for learning, but not to make it so safe that nothing can be learned. I think that is everything for a parent, and that is the everyday challenge. I've got 5 kids myself, and I even see individually as well. It's a challenge because I see them as individuals, and they all need different boundaries and different structures. But like understanding how anything works, if we don't understand how it works, it's harder to, yes, we can go off gut feeling. And I very much like you, I'm a little bit, look, what's the harm? It's all part of their world now. They need to understand it. But as you've talked about in the book, which hopefully you'll be able to expand on a little bit, there is something that we do need to worry about.
Yeah, so one of the things that struck me straight away was, which I hadn't been aware of at all, never encountered this, but that puberty or adolescence from the start of puberty till the mid-20s is a unique time in the biochemistry of our brain. There's a neurotransmitter called GABA, G-A-B-A, which is kind of a braking system for our brain. And one of the things that it puts a brake on is us entering puberty. So the reason we don't go into puberty straight after birth is because GABA is sort of suppressing everything until our body is ready for that to happen. Then it triggers and it dials right down and puberty is allowed to occur. And the kind of changes that happen in the teenage brain, which are all about learning to manage themselves as a social animal, learning how to interact with other humans, not get killed by them, do get loved by them, all of that kind of thing happens in the teenage years. And the kind of brain changes that are required for that need GABA, our braking system, to be turned off. Now, that's fine and has been fine throughout the history of humanity. There's nothing new about that. It's always been there. The problem is that one of the things that the braking system does is stops us becoming addicted to things. So things that we would have mildly liked when we were a kid, or had we encountered them for the first time when we were an adult, turn into potentially highly addictive behaviours during that phase when our braking system is turned off. Which is teenagerdom. Now, throughout history, that hasn't been much of a problem because there's not much to be addicted to. Prior to the 1960s, cigarettes and alcohol was pretty much it. In the 60s, more dangerous drugs started to be experimented with. Gambling became more widespread, and so on. But we're still talking about a relatively small subset of the population. During the 80s and 90s, it grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the noughties, it started to really affect a large number of people. And the statistics on addiction-related behaviour in teenagers was tracking along with that. So teenage pregnancy, drug taking, alcohol consumption, all of that kind of thing was tracking all the way up like that. And then in 2010, something really dramatic happened. which is it all stopped. Suddenly, none of those things was going up. In fact, they were going down. There's half as many teenage pregnancies now as there were in 2007. A kid is half as likely to be involved in illicit drugs, half as likely to even drink alcohol, for goodness sake. So everything has gone into reverse on the addiction front. That's really bizarre. What on earth could possibly have caused that to happen? And the answer is we replaced that addiction with something much more powerful, which is software. We replaced it with software which is more addictive and more available. Now it's not just a few kids, it's everybody all the time who have 24/7 access to highly portable devices that are loaded with highly addictive software. And when people say to me, "Oh, you must be insane, you can't get addicted to software," they obviously have no concept of the way the software industry works. It is a dog-eat-dog industry. There are hundreds of millions of companies out there trying to get your finger to tap their app on your screen. And every pixel is thought about, every color is thought about, every sound is thought about. They must get you to click theirs. And the ones that win that race are the ones that win. And the only way they can do that is to get humans addicted to them. Whilst we have gotten rid of all of the traditional methods of addiction which require a person to be physically present, we've replaced it with methods of addiction which you can do from your bedroom and which you can access 24 hours a day, and that every child in the population can and does access. Something fairly predictable has come from that. We've known for a long time that addiction drives depression and anxiety in teenagers. It's the peak time during our lifetime for depression and anxiety, teenage years, and that's because the braking system is dialed down and addiction goes up. Now you would expect, if all of the traditional sources of addiction had disappeared, that anxiety and depression would be disappearing too, but they're not. They've doubled in the same period. So the thing that's replaced them has made it much worse, not much better.
Absolutely. I was so fascinated to read that in your book because I had, I guess, observed that. And I've said to a couple of my friends, well, I just don't see the kids, they don't seem to be going to parties, and I'm not really concerned about my kids drinking or smoking and I have to be honest and say I actually put it down to good parenting. I thought, maybe I'm doing okay. And I had absolutely no idea that instead it was being replaced by their iPhones and Fortnite and all these other things going on. And of course, you talk about the farming the likes of social media that's going on.
So they've been replaced by a lot of simulators. So our reward system works when it's operating properly. It works to ensure we do things that propagate the species and don't do things that don't. So our reward system makes sure we have sex and desire it. It makes sure we eat and desire that. And it makes sure that we go in the opposite direction from danger. And that's how it's supposed to work. It's like an innocuous version of addiction in that it motivates you to do the desired behavior, but not so much that you want to do it all the time. So there's a self-limiting capability in there. Now, what traditional sexual pornography, for example, does is run a simulation of sexual behavior that you can repeatedly do very quickly, so that it presses that button that makes that behavior able to be accessed rapidly. And every time you do that, you increase a set point in the brain called a delta phos-B, which requires that the next time you do it, you need more dopamine to be satisfied. And then the next time you need even more. And then you're turning a reward system into an addiction system. And so that's how porn works, traditional sexual porn works. But what we've actually managed to do since 2010 is create simulators, or what I call porn, for other things which can be addictive. So there are other things which we should do to propagate the species. One is we should socialize. We should work together in groups. We should help each other. In other words, behave as a community. And we have hormones that cause that to happen. One called oxytocin, which is girls are particularly sensitive to, which forces them to work together, to have an in-crew and in-gang, and protect the interests of that in-gang and attack the interests of anyone outside that gang. Now, that has been simulated by what I call approval porn, which is that in real life, the only way to get that hit of oxytocin is to socialize with people and behave in a way that obtains approval. That's hard to do at a rate which would allow you to become addicted to it. Desire it? Yes. Become addicted to it? No. However, when you get to something like Instagram or Facebook or so on, they've actually engineered a simulation of that approval called likes and comments that allows you to simulate that interaction at a high rate and turn like into addiction. So that's what I call approval porn. Same thing happens for boys with something I call danger porn, which is in real life, we have a reward system which is wired also in reverse to make us run away from danger, but at the same time it gives us a reward, which is when we survive, we are relieved that we have survived. So that's the incentive to run away from danger. Now, boys in particular can be engineered to simulate that, and that's called gaming. So games like Fortnite and so on, it has all of the stimulation of danger and relief of survival without actually having to put yourself in danger. So approval porn dominated by girls doesn't mean boys can't do it, but girls prefer it, and danger porn dominated by boys is two of the ways that we are being addicted to software.
And why wouldn't we be surprised about that? You know, you look at nutrition, billions of dollars are spent to get that bliss point, to get us addicted to food.
Absolutely.
So this would be no different. And you mentioned in the book about how a lot of people that work, even, was it the Mr. Apple?
Steve Jobs.
So wouldn't let his kids anywhere near what he invented with the iPhone.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of people in the tech industry do not let their kids have access to these devices because they work in the industry. They know the effort that goes into making them addictive, and they don't want their kids using them. You know, don't get high on your own supply. They're following that rule, which is don't get your kids high on your own supply. And it's increasingly becoming the case that, there's stories appearing all the time now about, nannies in Silicon Valley being instructed that if they're caught, on their phone near the children, they will be dismissed. Things like that, which bring home the fact that these people know exactly what they're doing. And anyone who's ever had anything to do with creating this kind of software knows that that's what's involved. The point is to make sure people keep coming back. The only way you're going to do that is hook up to the system, to the body's reward system.
Yeah, and as you said, if you create an app these days and it doesn't have that in it, well, you're not going to make any money, are you?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, that's why we need to be aware of it, because I guess we can't change any of that, but we can have the knowledge and protect our kids a little bit and find that balance, as we said, between providing that safe environment and that environment where they don't learn where they're not in danger. So what is the answer? I mean, in the book, and obviously parents, you're going to have to buy this book, guys, because there is so much in it. There is absolutely no way David and I could go through everything. Got highlights everywhere, as I do with all of your books. But what are the answers for parents?
The answers are obvious. They're the answers you would have come up with yourself had you realised that there was anything to worry about, which is obviously keep the devices away from them if you can. The difficulty most parents have today in Australia in particular is that schools are the dealers. Schools are requiring these kids to have highly portable devices on their person at all times. It's not that it's a computer. It's that it can be taken anywhere, anytime, and can access the internet all the time. There's nothing inherently wrong with computers. If we had computer labs at schools with the computers still firmly attached to the walls and kids cycling through them to learn whatever they needed to learn on a computer, that would be fine. The problem is giving these kids a highly portable device that can access every addictive piece of software in the world and expecting them to control that, which is ridiculous. That is like handing a kid a packet of cigarettes and 3 stiff vodkas before going to school and telling them not to touch them. You can't expect people to self-control in that way. And we've got to do as much as we can to put in place the boundaries that their brains cannot put in place. Now, I'm not picking on teenagers. Their brains literally cannot put those boundaries in place because the control system that would do it, remember, has been shut down by puberty. Right. So they literally can't do it. They have no adult supervision. We have to provide it.
the big thing about that, that along with that is I didn't even realize that you talk in the book about your brain. So the brain starts at 3 weeks gestation, actually doesn't finish until about 25.
That's right. Mid-20s, it's complete. And all of the stuff that really makes us work together as a communal animal doesn't start happening until puberty. So the whole prefrontal cortex, the stuff that does our supervision, our behavior control, our impulse control, our self-discipline, all that stuff doesn't get built until they start puberty.
Okay, so setting rules, as you call them, not
Yes.
boundaries, that means actually saying no to our kids. So
Yeah.
can be challenging.
Well, very, very, very challenging for parents of Gen Z who were probably raised in an environment that was kid-centric. So parenting styles have changed a lot as we've transitioned from large families, average of 3.8-ish kids after the Second World War, to small families, which is an average of 1.7, and a significant change in the demographics of society where it's rarely the case now that both parents are at home or that one parent is at home all the time. So we've tended to go towards a model of kid-centric parenting, which essentially means not saying no much. When the kid wants something, they get it as a general rule, and the parents would rather not spend the limited time they have with their children fighting with them. And so kid-centric parenting has meant that we now have a generation of kids who don't hear the word no very often. And when they do hear it, they rebel against it fairly loudly and make parents even less likely to say it next time. And I guess the one thing a parent should take away from all of this work in the book is that you've got to learn to say no a lot more often. It's about discipline, ours, not theirs, which is no matter how much aggro we're going to get, we've got to say no today and we've got to say no tomorrow, and we've got to mean it both times. And every time we do it and mean it, we're more likely to be able to do it the next time. There's some very interesting work I look at in the book about even as early as things like demand feeding, where the studies show that parents who schedule feed, which is an extremely small minority now, are 16 or 17 times more confident in their parenting abilities than parents who demand feed. And that's simply because their kids have learned right from an early age what no means. It means the kid will fit in with the parent, not the other way around. It doesn't mean being mean to your kids. It doesn't mean being nasty to them. It means you are setting the schedule, not them.
Certainly changed a lot. So my eldest is 17 and my youngest is 4. So I've seen a lot of things change over that time. And I mean, I have definitely control cried all of my children at some point. Robin Barker was sort of my guru. She had parenting books that were really practical. And she sort of said, look, if your kids have met all that criteria, you know, it is okay to let them cry, and it can teach them to sleep well so that you all as a family can get a bit more sleep, because we know what sleep deprivation does, particularly to parents. I mean, it isn't good.
Yeah, it's about, as you said, you can't let a child cry unless you know there's no reason for them to be crying. I mean, you've got to make sure that they don't have a dirty nappy, that they're not hungry, et cetera, et cetera. But once you're satisfied of that, then we discovered controlled crying out of necessity with our first child. He was killing us. Honestly, he was killing us. It was just neither of us were getting any sleep, and he had us wrapped around his little finger. We started controlled crying, and the next night, that was it. He hadn't bothered us at all, and that was, the rest of our life was sorted. Suddenly, we were both getting more sleep, or getting some, and we've never looked back from that. And as long as the kid's okay and safe, and there isn't a reason for them to be crying other than that they want our attention, saying no is not a bad thing. And that's firmly my view, and that's backed up by the research that I set out in the book about saying no early is not a bad thing. That does not mean you do not let kids try stuff out that might be dangerous. And that's the other extreme, which is what they call snowplow parenting, preparing the road for the kids rather than the kids for the road, is, solving all life's problems for them can be just as big a problem, which is there are no natural consequences. And the analogy I use in the book is, well, when you let when your kid's learning to stand, for example, a baby's learning to stand, you don't hold on to them the entire time in case they fall, because they've got to learn what falling feels like and how to correct. But you also don't put them on the freeway and tell them to, learn about natural consequences. You provide a safe environment for them to fall. And the same thing applies to teenagers, which is they've got to find out about natural consequences. And all too often, I hear stories now, particularly when I was doing interviews for this book, of parents who are not prepared to let their kids discover natural consequences. When the child forgets their homework, they leave work, take time off, go home, get the homework, take it to the child at school. The natural consequence of forgetting your homework is you get punished for forgetting your homework. Then you never do it again. If mum rescues you or dad rescues you every time, you've never experienced a natural consequence, you never learn. And it's the same deal, which is teenagers will push boundaries. They are designed to do that. They are growing up. They are learning where the boundaries are. They are learning how far they can be pushed. If we save them from every consequence, they'll learn nothing.
That's right. I was going to just read a little part here that kind of puts all that in perspective, I think, in a practical sense for parents. When you've talked to a clinical psychologist, and he says basically that it'd be a big call to say that screens cause anxiety and depression, but he believes they definitely make it worse. He says the level of dependency on screens is directly correlated with the parent's ability to set boundaries. A lot of his work with families is aimed at helping parents to take back control, but he says if a teenager already has the reins and has never experienced a parenting enforcing boundaries, it's an almost impossible task. I mean, I don't think that parents of teenagers should read that as there's no hope. It's that obviously the earlier we get it, the easier it is for us, but there's always going to be, it's always good to start setting boundaries.
It's better to start today than tomorrow. It's the same as with deleting sugar from your life. You can't read a book about deleting sugar and say, gosh, I wish I'd known this 20 years ago, therefore I'm going to give up. The sooner you start, the better off you are. And the same goes with this, which is the sooner you start saying no, setting rules and enforcing them, the easier it's going to be to keep doing it. But that doesn't mean if you haven't done it up till now, you don't bother.
That's right. And something else that struck me from your book is how it's important for kids to have a male they respect, particularly boys, to have that male in their life that they do respect.
Yeah, so, that comes from, there's a lot of research in monkeys and apes, which we share a lot of genetics with, and also a lot of our social organisation. And one of the interesting things is chimpanzee research, where they look at adolescent males and they say adolescent males will do what their mother tells them to do up until the point where they are bigger than their mother. Yes. And then not so much. And the way that they are controlled amongst apes and so on is that the males then take over, and because they are bigger, they tell them what to do and they listen and obey. And there's absolutely no reason to suspect that anything different operates in humans. Is that teenage boys are filled to the eyeballs with testosterone. As I say in the book, they've got enough testosterone to kill a Mallee bull, and it's not at their control. Add that to the reduced impulse control that comes with puberty dialing down GABA, and you have someone who has significant physical capability, no ability to judge the risk of a situation, no ability to judge the consequences of a situation, and no impulse control. You need someone who can just physically stop them in some situations.
So it's important, I think, as parents, if we haven't got that person around to cultivate it in some way, I guess, in the community that we live in. And it is really, really important. My eldest son is 6'5" now. And I only said to him about a month ago, I said something to him and he disagreed with me. And I said to him, you still agree with everything I said? And he goes, yeah, well, it's called growing up, Mum. So it's sort of like, yeah, well, it's been fascinating. I mean, it's such a great book. And so what would be some last tips that you could give parents?
There's a general tip, which is have rules, stick to them, and enforce them. And any rule that has a natural consequence should be absolute top of the pile. If allowing the child to break that rule will give you a natural consequence, they will learn much more quickly from that than from any punishment you could impose. don't have it all be negative. Don't have it all be punishment. Have there be positives for positive behaviour, things that you want to encourage. Positive works just as well as a negative, and often the best punishments are a combination of both. You'll be punished for breaking the rule this time, but if you don't break it next time, then there'll be a positive. Specifically, and I would say the most dangerous thing to kids these days, to Gen Z, is they are the first generation ever to be exposed to non-stop electronic addiction. So it is the highest priority. Limit their access to that. You cannot, I wish I could say to you, eliminate their access to that, but I can't. That's just impossible. They are attending schools with kids all around them using these devices. The school is often mandating they have them. Even when they're at home, there's the "but I need it for homework" excuse.
Yeah.
And you can't eliminate it. I wish I could just say, throw them all in the bin and be done with it, but that isn't going to happen. The next best thing is tightly control usage. Know where they are at all times. Have a place in the house where they should be when they're not being used for homework. And even when they are being used for homework, make sure that work is being done in a place where anyone can see the screen.
They're great tips. Do you think the education department will be open to reading what you've done here?
Probably not.
No. Okay.
Just because there's too much invested in this, too many careers, too much money invested in this. It's going to take a massive wave of protest before anything changes. Interestingly, I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal just yesterday which said essentially that screens are becoming poor people's things, that rich people, knowing the dangers of them, are tending to require that their kids not have anything to do with screens. And so human interaction is a luxury good, and screen interaction is for the poor people. And you know what, that might be, people might say that's a bit of overreach, but it's certainly starting to feel a bit like that.
Well, that's kind of what the cigarette companies did too when they, couldn't make as much money in the Western world. They went to the other parts of the world, didn't they? So it makes sense when you look at what's happened in the past about the flow of all this sort of stuff. You shared an experience in the book about how you actually said no to your school about buying a device.
Oh, yes. It didn't get us very far.
No.
I mean, we found out, we hauled up to the office and we found out that we would be the only people in the entire grade not buying the device. This is in a public school, mind you, and not a rich one by any stretch of the imagination. And apparently every other parent had decided that they wished to purchase the device. And that's part of it, is that schools saying this is necessary for education and parents desiring the latest and the greatest drives adoption of this stuff without any documented proof of benefit whatsoever. And the physical cost to the school in having to provide the infrastructure for these things, and to the parents in having to provide the devices, is just the tip of the iceberg of the damage they are doing. But yeah, we didn't get very far with that. In the end, we were effectively told that if children didn't get devices, they would be put into a mixed class with younger kids, so taken away from their friends essentially, and who were a class that wouldn't be using devices. Now, even that was years ago, but now that probably even wouldn't be offered, because now devices are being introduced so early in primary school that there's no such thing as a class that doesn't have devices.
Yeah, that's right. Wow. Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. Is your book available? Is it out tomorrow?
It's out tomorrow. Yes, you're hot off the presses here. It's out tomorrow.
Fantastic. Well, I'll have all the information below for people who want to find your book, and yeah, good luck with it all. And thank you so much for writing this stuff and for sharing what you do. As I said, it's definitely changed my life and my kids' lives. And I told them I was talking to you today, and they're like, "Oh, that's exciting, Mum." And I know they're thinking, "Oh, geez, yeah. What's going to come now?"
No. My friends my kids' friends say, "Oh God, we've just been through all this with my parents reading his book about sugar, and now they're going to thing on the whole iPad thing." So they're not looking forward.
But it's all worth it, and thankfully, there's someone like you writing about this and sharing this stuff with us. So again, thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for talking with me.
Thank you for listening to the Nourished Mumlife podcast. If you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate you leaving a comment and rating the podcast and letting anybody else know who might be interested in listening. Thanks so much.